What is up, heathens? How y'all doing? Are you guys ready for the video tonight? I hope that you are, because we are going to be debunking the hydroplate theory. We have a video that was suggested by one of you heathens. We're taking a look at it. We're going to break it down.
The mountains were smaller than today's, perhaps 6,000 feet high. Before the flood, about half the Earth's water was in interconnected chambers, about 10 miles below the Earth's surface. This formed a thin spherical shell, almost a mile thick. The pressure in the subterranean chamber had been increasing for centuries because the gravity of the sun and moon produced tides in the subterranean water that lifted and lowered the Earth's massive crust twice a day. This tidal pumping added gigantic amounts of energy to the subterranean water.
We're going to talk about why he's wrong, why he's pulling shit out of his ass. We're going to be discussing all of that tonight. So I hope that you heathens are ready. And I guess I'll see you here in a second. So we're looking at a defense of the hydroplate theory from the originator himself, Dr. Walter Brown. This hydroplate theory has been around for a while, actually, ranging from the mid-90s is when, or I think early 80s, actually, is where he first published his book and his theory on it, He's never allowed it to really be meticulously criticized or looked at or anything like that. He just presents his shit and then it's just like, fuck you if you don't believe me. So what this theory does is basically it tries to think up a natural explanation for a supernatural event. That supernatural event being the flood, the global flood that Noah supposedly experienced in Genesis. It's just really fucking weird because you have a supernatural event and they want a natural explanation for it. That shouldn't make sense. For them, it supposedly does. Now, whale dick enthusiast Kent Hovind also uses this particular theory in his slides. This is how they're going to set up Dr. Walter Brown. Okay, just think about it for a second. This is how they choose to represent him.
Could it be that hidden within this simple description, the answers to the skeptic's most difficult questions may be found? Having served as director of one of the United States Defense Department's major research and development laboratories, Dr. Walter Brown comes with an impressive list of credentials and credibility. In tackling the subject of Earth's geological development, Dr. Brown has developed a theory that contradicts the generally accepted viewpoint of the scientific community.
This is how they choose to set him up. I have yet to find out what DoD research and development organization or lab that he was supposedly the head of. What I did find out is that he does have a doctorate in mechanical engineering, and he used to work for the Army and the Navy. And he retired in 1980, and then after that point, he became the president or whatever of his own organization called like Creation Science something or another. Like I said, he does have a PhD, so he is actually a doctor in mechanical engineering. He doesn't actually have anything that would give him the expertise to really develop this theory completely. But they set him up as an authority, and that's where the disingenuous nature starts in this entire thing. So right off the bat here, starting off from a very disingenuous point. The weird thing is that every single expert in this field, old Earth creationists and secular, have debunked his particular idea of the hydroplate theory. Everybody thinks that it's a crazy fucking idea, and you're going to find out why in this particular video tonight.
Profound and far-reaching, this respected scientist's hydroplate theory not only offers a completely new approach to the geological sciences, it succeeds where the prevailing theory often fails. It simply and logically explains some of the Earth's most profound mysteries.
We can see on our planet 25 major features that can now be systematically explained as a consequence of a global flood that erupted from subterranean chambers with an energy release exceeding the explosion of 30 trillion hydrogen bombs.
I want you to keep that in mind. The energy released in this supposed event was greater than 30 trillion hydrogen bombs, and that's coming from himself, right? We're going to find out later why that really doesn't help his theory. Like, he's using big numbers to make it sound like it's more credible or something like that, but it only adds more problems onto his particular idea here. The hydroplate theory doesn't do any of the things that he's talking about. The prevailing theories or the prevailing explanations are things like plate tectonics, uniformitarianism, and just basic geology in general. Another thing to keep in mind here is that they're claiming to have a better explanation than the prevailing explanation, which would be naturalism, which would be geology, plate tectonics, uniformitarianism, all of the basic things that we know of, like about the Earth. He's saying that this theory does a better job at explaining things. So just keep that in mind, along with 30 trillion hydrogen bombs.
This theory shows us just how rapidly major mountains form. It explains the coal, oil, and methane deposits, the rapid continental drift, and why on the ocean floor there are huge trenches, hundreds of canyons, and tens of thousands of volcanoes. This theory also explains the ice ages, and it gives the primary reason for global warming. It explains the formation of the layered strata in almost all fossils, the frozen mammoths, and major land canyons, especially the Grand Canyon. Surprisingly, it explains the origin of comets, of asteroids, and of meteorites.
I want you to think about what he said just a few moments ago. He said that this explanation discusses things that we currently don't have explanations for, or that we don't have good explanations for, and that this is a better explanation for the prevailing explanations that we have. Everything that he just listed, we have good explanations for, that have explanatory power beyond anything that creationism has ever provided us. I don't know how he's supposed to give us these explanations for things that we weren't able to explain before, when he lists things that we've already been able to explain naturally. And I mean, they really can't list any phenomena that this hydroplate theory is going to be able to explain better, because it can't better explain things that we already have an explanation for.
According to Dr. Brown's theory, the ancient world that Noah lived in was very different from the Earth we occupy today.
Noah and other pre-flood people probably lived on one very large supercontinent with lush vegetation, inland seas, and major rivers. The mountains were smaller than today's, perhaps 6,000 feet high.
Oh, okay. You might think that he's talking about Pangaea, but he's not. That particular continent was smaller than the one that he's talking about, because you got to understand, the one that he's talking about, it covered so much of the Earth that the water on the Earth was really just these big lakes, right? That's what they amounted to. So this supercontinent covered all of the Earth with just big lakes that were resting on top of it, right? You could do calculations on what the Earth would look like, all of the forces acting upon it. And being that on this Earth there were no fault lines at all, there were no tectonic plates, there were no cracks, it was just a giant enclosed sphere. Mountains would be impossible in this situation. For one thing, any mountain that would be resting on this would definitely cause cracks and fissures on this thing. It would have to be super thick in order for a mountain to even form on top of it, and even then, it would still cause cracks and fissures eventually. They say that mountains would be like 6,000 feet high. These mountains just simply couldn't have existed on this particular version of the Earth. And all this boils down to is a special pleading argument, because what he's saying here is that reality operated differently prior to the flood. That the Earth was a perfect spherical sort of egg that existed. It didn't operate by the laws of physics that we have now. The laws of physics that were in existence prior to the flood are completely different than the laws of physics that happened after the flood. You would think that he would maybe have some evidence to suggest that this is the way things were, but he actually doesn't. All he's saying is that, oh, it had to be this way because the Bible says that it was this way. So therefore, it has to be that the laws of physics operated completely differently. It all boils down to a special pleading argument.
Before the flood, about half the Earth's water was in interconnected chambers, about 10 miles below the Earth's surface. This formed a thin spherical shell, almost a mile thick, The pressure in the subterranean chamber had been increasing for centuries because the gravity of the sun and moon produced tides in the subterranean water that lifted and lowered the Earth's massive crust twice a day. This tidal pumping added gigantic amounts of energy to the subterranean water. This increasing pressure in the subterranean water steadily stretched the crust as a balloon stretches when the pressure inside increases. Failure in the crust began as a microscopic crack that grew in both directions at almost 3 miles per second.
I don't understand how these underwater waves would have built up a lot of pressure. I also don't understand why he thinks that the sun and moon would have such an effect on these underwater oceans that he just claims to exist. Even if they did, why would it cause the pressure to build up? I guess his claim would be that the friction of the water on the crust and everything like that was causing heat or something like that. But I do have to say that this guy goes a lot farther than even Kent Hovind, because I couldn't get Kent Hovind to tell me what was causing this pressure from underneath. At least this guy has some kind of explanation for what caused the pressure to be there to cause the water to, try to force its way out from underneath the crust. You have to understand something. That this pressure that he's talking about that eventually caused the fracturing of the crust, from its perfect shell nature to what it is, not now, but what it was when the fountains broke open and spurted water everywhere. You have to understand that this pressure has to be so great that it shoots water out 17 kilometers in the air, because what he's got is a 10 kilometer thick crust, and then you got 1 kilometer of water. So this pressure has to push out from the very bottom of that layer all the way up, which 6,000 foot, because of the mountains, right? So you have to go the 11 and then 6 more, 17 kilometers. So this has to be enough energy to push all of that water out from underneath the crust, covering the Earth. There's a pretty big problem with that. As we'll see, that the amount of energy required for this to push the water out, before the water even reaches the surface of the Earth, it would be vaporized. After that point, it would be going so fast, which, by the way, in the links that I'm going to provide, if you look, the water is going to be traveling at over 500 kilometers per hour. The escape velocity of Earth is 11 kilometers an hour. So this water would be jettisoned off of the Earth, out of its gravitational pull, and the Earth would just fucking explode. And we'll get a little bit more into that. But basically what this boils down to is special pleading winning again. It's always special pleading because, it had to work, especially because the laws of physics just didn't operate in the exact same fashion.
The crack, following the path of least resistance, encircled the globe in about 2 hours. As the crack raced around the Earth, the overlying rock crust opened up like a rip in a tightly stretched claw. So the water exploded violently out of the rupture.
There's literally no evidence that this ever happened. There's no physical evidence, no geological evidence. Nothing ever suggests that this actually happened. They are just baselessly asserting this. It's tantamount to me just asserting that giant fucking unicorns had a bitch fit on the face of the Earth and cracked it open. There's as much evidence for giant unicorns as there is for the shit that he's talking about.
The Bible even gives us a precise date. The 600th year, Noah's life, on the 17th day of the 2nd month. On that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst open. Then it says, and the rain fell. The fountains of water jetted supersonically into and above the atmosphere. The spray from these enormous fountains produced torrential rain such as the Earth has never experienced before or after. The supersonic fountains eroded the crumbling rock on both sides of the widening crack. This produced huge volumes of sediments that settled through the floodwaters, trapping and burying plants and animals, forming the fossil record. Eventually, the crack became so wide that the newly exposed floor of the subterranean chamber sprung upward, giving birth to the mid-oceanic ridge that wraps around the Earth like the seam of a baseball.
Like I said before, the amount of energy that he's talking about here would just jettison the water completely off of the Earth in a water vapor form. So there would be no forming these clouds in the skies, causing torrential rainfall down on the earth, because it would be going so fast, which I think before I said kilometers an hour, I meant kilometers a second, but it would be going over 500 kilometers a second, which the escape velocity from the earth is 11 kilometers a second. It would be spraying this water vapor into space so far from the earth that there would be nothing like on the earth as far as water goes, but also the amount of heat generated at that point would also cook everything on the earth. It would blow off the atmosphere. It would cook the atmosphere. Actually, if just 0.001% of the amount of energy and mass that would have to be ejected from the earth to do the things that he's talking about, it would instantly cause the atmosphere to increase by 3,000 degrees Celsius. And that's just 1/1000th of the amount of energy required for this. It doesn't make sense. Also, this whole mid-Atlantic ridge forming thing, there's no evidence that suggests that the way that he depicts it as happening happens. There's no physical evidence, there's no geological evidence. So it's just, again, baseless assertions that this is how it had to happen. He's starting from his conclusion that waters erupted from the fountains of the deep and all this other stuff, just like the Bible says, with its quote-unquote ultra-specific dating method. He's starting from there, and then he's like, well, this explains that. And he's going about it in a bass-backwards way.
The continental plates, with lubricating water still beneath them, slid downhill away from the rising mid-Atlantic ridge. After the massive, slowly accelerating continental plates reached speeds of approximately 40 to 50 miles per hour, they ran into resistances, and like a runaway crashing train, they compressed, crushed, buckled, and thickened, rising out of the floodwaters. This is why the major mountains are generally parallel to the oceanic ridges from which they slid. Today's major mountains were all pushed up in hours. The hydroplates, in sliding away from the mid-Atlantic ridge, opened up very deep ocean basins into which the floodwaters retreated.
Okay, so this, if you couldn't already taste the pseudoscience in this video, it kind of really stands out. Convincing pseudoscience is rooted in a little bit of reality, right? And that's what makes it believable. The reality here is that mountains are indeed pushed up from the surface. But the pseudoscience part here is that continents were traveling at 40 to 50 miles an hour and buckled and shrunk and pushed up and then created mountains. There's no geological evidence for this whatsoever. You literally don't have to try to prove this wrong because he doesn't have any evidence that actually suggests that this happened. Also, the amount of energy from the friction and all this other shit that would have been generated at the continents traveling at 40 to 50 miles an hour, any water that was left on the earth would have been evaporated because the amount of energy created in that would have just been ridiculous. Not to mention the fact that after these fountains opened up, the earth would have been totally obliterated. I think he's going to get into this here in a minute, but he claims that meteorites and asteroids and all of the other planetary bodies and everything like that, well, I guess really just comets, asteroids, and trans-Neptunian objects are created from this particular situation, right? All of the comet and asteroid material and the TNOs, the trans-Neptunian objects, all of that material would be 100 times more than what the Earth currently has and what the Earth has ever had. So it doesn't make a lot of sense. Again, they're special pleading their way into their whole idea. They're starting from their conclusion and they're saying, it explains it because of this. And they're just baselessly asserting that it worked that way and saying that laws of physics didn't matter at that time. They operated differently. You have to wonder, at what point do you find yourself just being like, well, the God did it that way because that's the way that he wanted it done, just isn't a very compelling argument. It starts getting very repetitive after a point, and it's not satisfactory.
This theory of a massive worldwide catastrophe in antiquity appears to support the biblical story of the deluge in every detail. But what other evidence exists to support this amazing theory?
This is an example of bass-backwards science. You see, here's the problem. What he does is he starts with his conclusion, what I've already said. He starts with his conclusion. The Bible says this happened. And so then he's like, well, what other evidence can I find that supports this. That's not how science is done. That's not how the scientific method actually operates. But this entire video is made under the guise that it's some kind of scientific explanation for a supernatural event. How you would actually do it is you would have a hypothesis. Like, a worldwide flood occurred thousands of years ago that wiped out all life on Earth except for one human family. So then, taking that hypothesis, you would look at, like, observations, and you would look at the evidence and say, well, what does my hypothesis not explain? What breaks my hypothesis? And you see, that's where he goes backwards. Because he's not looking for things that will potentially disprove his hypothesis. What he's looking for are only the things that support his hypothesis